A bank employee quietly pressed a hidden alarm as John Dillinger's gang took control of the Security National Bank in Sioux Falls. Outside, motorcycle officer Hale Keith ran toward the building, unaware that babyface Nelson was watching him through a plate glass window. Nelson climbed onto the desk, raised his Thompson submachine gun, and opened fire. Keith collapsed in the street, and Nelson reportedly celebrated, believing he had killed him. But the officer lying motionless outside the bank was still alive. How did one silent alarm turn a carefully planned bank robbery into one of the clearest demonstrations of babyface Nelson's willingness to kill? On the morning of March 6, 1934, John Dillinger had been free for only 3 days after escaping the supposedly secure jail at Crown Point, Indiana. He quickly joined a newly assembled gang that included Lester Gillis, better known as Babyface Nelson, and headed west towards Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Shortly before 10 o'clock, 6 men arrived outside the Security National Bank in a green Packard. 4 prepared to enter while 2 remained outside to control the street. Their Thompson submachine guns were concealed beneath long coats, and the brims of their hats were pulled low over their faces. One bank employee reportedly watched the Packard approaching and remarked that it looked exactly like a holdup car. Moments later, Dillinger and others walked through the doors, drew their weapons, and announced the robbery. The gang's objective was simple: seize as much cash as possible, control everyone inside the bank, and escape before local police could organize a response. A successful robbery depended on speed, discipline, and control. Employees had to be kept away from the telephones, customers had to remain still, and no one outside could be allowed to interfere with the getaway. Nelson had only recently joined Dillinger, Homer Van Meter, and others. The robbery would require him to follow their plan, remain under control, and avoid unnecessary violence. If every man performed his assigned role, the gang could collect the money and leave Sioux Falls before serious resistance developed. But the entire plan depended on silence, and one bank employee had already reached for the alarm. The plan began to unravel almost immediately. The hidden alarm alerted people outside the bank, and word of the robbery spread through downtown Sioux Falls. Curious residents gathered around the streets while police officers moved toward the building, turning the gang's quiet escape route into a crowded and increasingly dangerous scene. Motorcycle officer Hale Keith was among those who responded. He approached the bank without knowing exactly where the gunmen were positioned. While inside, Nelson watched the streets through the large plate glass windows. The gang now faced the problem Dillinger had hoped to avoid. They were trapped inside with employees and customers while armed police closed in outside. They still had the money, but every passing second gave authorities more time to block the streets, surround the Packard, and cut off their escape. For Nelson, however, the approaching officer was not simply an obstacle, he was a target. Nelson climbed onto a desk near the front window, raised his Thompson submachine gun, and fired through the plate glass at Hale Keith. Bullets struck the officer in the abdomen, arms, and leg, throwing him into the street. Keith rolled into the gutter and lay completely still, hoping the gunman would believe he was dead. Nelson reportedly shouted that he had gotten one of the officers, convinced the threat outside had been eliminated. The gunfire transformed the robbery. What had begun as a controlled attempt to seize money was now an armed confrontation in the middle of downtown Sioux Falls, with a wounded policeman lying outside, crowds watching from nearby buildings, and law enforcement converging on the bank. The gang could no longer slip away. To escape, they would have to cross the exposed street and use people inside as protection. With nearly $50,000 in stolen money, the gangsters surrounded themselves with employees and customers and marched from the bank behind a human shield. 5 bank employees were forced onto the Packard's running boards, preventing officers from firing without risking innocent lives. As the car raced downtown, police damaged its radiator, but the gang fired at pursuing vehicles and scattered roofing nails across the road. When the Packard began failing outside Sioux Falls, the robbers again used their hostages for protection, seized another automobile, and continued their escape. The hostages were released about 10 miles outside the city, and the gang eventually returned safely to the Twin Cities. Despite the gunfire, no one was killed. Hale Keith survived his wounds after remaining motionless in the gutter and allowing Nelson to believe he was dead. The alarm had failed to stop the robbery, but it revealed exactly what made Nelson different. When confronted with danger, his first instinct was not merely to escape, it was to kill. The Security National Bank robbery succeeded. Dillinger's gang escaped with nearly $50,000, crossed the city behind hostages, changed automobiles, and disappeared before authorities could stop them. Yet the moment people remembered was not the money. It was the sight of Hale Keith lying motionless in the gutter while Nelson left Sioux Falls believing he had killed him. The hidden alarm had summoned help exactly as intended, but it also placed one unsuspecting officer directly in Nelson's sights. Keith survived not because Nelson showed resistance, but because he convinced Babyface Nelson that another killing had already been completed. Thank you for taking the time to watch and like the video and for subscribing to the channel. If you would like to support the Eclectic Historical Society, you can join our Patreon and order merch from our website, eclectichistoricalsociety.com. With that being said, this is the Eclectic Historical Society, and remember, history is lost if it's not repeated.